Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a really significant player with Canadian origins, but frankly, a massive global footprint. Brookfield Asset Management.
That's right.
We know many of you are trying to get a handle on the forces, both economic and political, that are shaping Canada right now. And Brookfield, well, their influence is definitely a key part of that whole picture.
Absolutely. It's a Canadian-founded, investment giant, but its operations span the globe.
So our mission today is basically to unpack Brookfield's influence, look at its connections to Canadian politics, and yeah, we have to talk about Mark Carney and explore what all this could mean for Canada going forward. We got some interesting sources lined up.
Exactly. We're talking financial reports, policy analysis, trying to piece together how this company's international dealings intersect with Canadian political life, especially with Carney in the mix, and what the potential outcomes might be.
Okay, let's get into it. Brookfield's holdings. I mean, they are just enormous. It's almost tough to visualize the scale. Can you maybe give us a better sense of just how widespread their operations are? Where do they really make their mark?
Sure. Brookfield operates across several really critical sectors. Take real estate, for example. Through Brookfield Properties and Brookfield Residential, they own things like major office towers, shopping malls, residential developments. Think Canary Wharf in London, that kind of scale.
Right, iconic stuff.
Yeah, so they're literally shaping city landscapes. Then you've got Brookfield Infrastructure Partners, or BIP.
The infrastructure side.
Exactly. Utilities, toll roads, ports, railways, really essential services that, underpin how economies function day to day.
Okay.
And they're huge in renewable energy, too, through Brookfield Renewable Partners, BEP. We're talking hydro, wind, solar, even battery storage. They're one of the biggest global players there.
So energy transition is big for them.
Definitely. And don't forget private equity Brookfield Business Partners, BBU. They own or have stakes in industrial companies, service businesses. Names like Clarios, the battery maker, or Brand Safway Industrial Services. It's a very wide net.
Wow.
And finally, there's credit and insurance. They've got a majority stake in Oaktree Capital Management, a huge credit investor, and own insurance firms like American National. So they're deep in the financial system itself, too.
So yeah, from the buildings around us, the roads we drive on, the power we use, even the financial system backing it all, Brookfield is deeply involved.
Pretty much.
Now, something that definitely got people talking here in Canada was that headquarters move. Why shift to New York late last year in 2024? What was the reaction beyond just sort of bruised national pride?
Well, the official line, the stated reasons, were mainly about getting better access to the much larger U.S. capital markets.
Okay. Makes sense financially, I guess.
Yeah, being included in major U.S. stock indices usually means more investment from big pension funds, endowments, that sort of thing. It could significantly boost their share price and access to capital.
Okay.
But as you said, it caused a real stir back here. Significant political backlash, lots of criticism. The feeling was that this company, with such deep Canadian roots, was maybe prioritizing Wall Street access over its ties to Canada's economy.
A perception issue, perhaps.
Definitely a perception issue. It raised questions about, where their primary focus would lie long-term, especially when making big strategic calls.
Felt symbolic, for sure. Okay, speaking of prominent figures in Brookfield, let's bring in Mark Carney. His name comes up constantly in relation to all this.
Right.
What's his actual connection, and how does it weave into Canadian politics, especially now with his leadership run?
Right. So Mark Carney was chair of Brookfield's Transition Investing Group. That was his role right before he jumped into the Liberal leadership race in 2025.
Okay, direct link there.
A very direct senior link. And of course, his resume is, extensive. Governor of the Bank of Canada, Governor of the Bank of England, UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. He's operated at the highest levels.
And the whole WEF plant thing people mention.
Look, that label itself isn't really backed by evidence. It's more political rhetoric. But it's undeniable he's deeply involved with the World Economic Forum and its agenda.
Which reflects mainstream global economic thinking, arguably.
Exactly. It places him firmly within those global leadership circles. But that very involvement, combined with his senior role at Brookfield and his political ambitions, well, it naturally invites scrutiny, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that scrutiny probably gets sharper when we look at Brookfield's international investments, especially the ones in China. Can you tell us more about those? How significant are they, and how does that feed into the political discussion around Carney?
Yeah, the China investments are significant. We're talking over $3 billion invested there by Brookfield.
$3 billion. Wow.
Examples include things like high-end real estate in Shanghai. And interestingly, some reports mention their partners in those deals having alleged links to the CPPCC, that's the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference.
Which is an influential body within the Chinese government structure.
Correct. And there was also a pretty sizable refinancing deal, about $276 million, with the Bank of China.
Okay, so close dealings with state-linked entities.
That's the concern, yes. This proximity to Chinese state actors, understandably, raises flags for some in Canada about potential national security issues or economic vulnerabilities.
And the Carney connection.
Well, the connection is that critics point to Carney's former senior position at Brookfield and ask about potential conflicts of interest. Could someone with those past ties, if they were in a position of political power, be influenced, even subconsciously, when it comes to making policy affecting Canada-China relations or investments?
Right. So these aren't just abstract financial deals.
Yeah.
They're seen as potentially creating political vulnerabilities, or at least the perception of them.
Precisely. And that perception feeds into a broader unease for some Canadians.
How does that play out more widely in terms of, say, public trust or the general political mood?
Well, you definitely see these kinds of connections contributing to an erosion of public trust among certain segments of the population. There's a feeling among critics that maybe Canada's foreign policy could be swayed, even subtly, by the business interests of these huge global corporations.
And politicians are picking up on this.
Oh, absolutely. Figures like Pierre Poilievre, for example, have been quite effective at leveraging these concerns. They tap into that populist sentiment, that feeling of economic nationalism, suggesting that maybe Canadian interests are being put second to, global corporate strategies.
Which logically leads to the question, should Canada be rethinking its whole approach to foreign investment, given the scale of companies like Brookfield and these political connections?
The sources we looked at definitely suggest it's a conversation worth having. The arguments for tightening things up often focus on a few key areas.
Such as?
Protecting national security, obviously. Maybe stricter screening processes for investments, particularly from certain countries or in sensitive sectors. Also, economic sovereignty, ensuring Canadian-based global firms remain somehow accountable to Canadian interests. Then there's corporate transparency, pushing back against complex offshore structures that can obscure ownership or tax obligations. And finally, managing that potential overlap between powerful business figures and political power.
Okay, those are strong arguments for reform. But what about the other side? What are the risks of going too far, making the rules too tough?
That's the balancing act, isn't it? There are real worries about capital flight. If regulations become too burdensome, will companies like Brookfield just invest less here or even accelerate moves offshore?
A legitimate concern.
Yeah. And could it make Canadian companies less competitive on the world stage if they face stricter rules than rivals elsewhere? Plus, you always risk retaliation from trading partners. If the U.S. or China feels their companies are being unfairly targeted by new Canadian rules, they might respond in kind.
So it's tricky. High stakes either way. If Canada did decide to overhaul its foreign investment policies, what might the actual effects look like, the good and the bad?
Well, on the positive side, you could potentially see stronger government oversight, maybe a boost in public confidence that national interests are being protected. You might even incentivize companies to keep deeper roots in Canada.
And the negatives?
The negatives are what we just touched on, potentially pushing firms like Brookfield further away, making Canada seem less attractive for investment overall, maybe adding more red tape and bureaucracy.
Did the sources offer any specific ideas or recommendations?
They did. Things like modernizing the Investment Canada Act, maybe creating a dedicated economic sovereignty review board to look at these complex cases. Also, better transparency rules for offshore subsidiaries and maybe even positive incentives, tax breaks, R&D support for companies that commit to keeping headquarters, jobs, and paying taxes in Canada.
Interesting. Okay, let's loop back to the politics, specifically the scenario of a potential Liberal government led by Mark Carney. Based on the sources and his stated positions from around 2025, what might that look like policy-wise? And would the Brookfield connection just linger?
Based on those 2025 proposals mentioned in the sources, you might expect maybe a centrist direction. For instance, talk about developing both clean and conventional energy suggests a move away from a purely green focus.
And the carbon tax.
The proposal mentioned was actually eliminating the federal consumer carbon tax, which would be a significant shift. Also, hex at increasing defense spending and wanting to renegotiate aspects of the relationship with the U.S.
So maybe more pragmatic, internationally focused?
Potentially. Increased international engagement seems likely, given his background. But, and this is a big but, it's almost certain the scrutiny over his Brookfield past wouldn't just disappear.
It would remain a political issue.
Highly likely. You'd probably see ongoing debates about potential conflicts of interest. And you can bet the conservative opposition would continue to frame the liberals, under his leadership, as being perhaps too close to corporate interests, maybe globalist agendas. Expect continued political polarization around that.
Right. So it really is this incredibly complex interplay we're seeing. You have Brookfield, this giant Canadian-born global entity. Its deep investments abroad, especially as we discussed in China.
Right.
And then these direct lines into the highest levels of Canadian politics through someone like Mark Carney vying for leadership.
Exactly. And the core tension that comes through in the sources is really that fundamental question. How does a country like Canada balance supporting the global success of its major corporations with the absolute need to protect its own national interests, maintain transparency, and crucially, keep the public's trust in its political leaders and institutions?
It definitely leaves you with a lot to process. So maybe the final thought for our listeners today is this. Considering everything we've laid out, Brookfield's immense reach, those significant China ties, the Mark Carney factor, what do you think are the most critical things Canada needs to weigh up as it tries to navigate this world where global finance and domestic politics are just so tightly woven together? It's a huge question for Canada's future direction.